Hi guys, I hope you're doing all right. And today what I'm going to be giving you in this short video is an overview of chapter 3. There are a lot of terms in chapter 3 that can be a little bit confusing. And so I want to break down a few of those things and just try to make sure that you're clear on some of those they call cultural characteristics that I think can sometimes be confusing. You'll note a different scenery. This is my home office here. And so just, I don't know, you'll see me kind of move around on these videos depending on where I can record them given the day. Also, if you need an overview of the assignments or anything that's due this week, there should be an overview video at the top of the list that talks about those things. So I hope you're doing all right and following everything okay. So let's get on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 talks a lot about culture and how our culture influences how we communicate with each other. And at the beginning of the chapter, there's a couple of different words that I think are important to know the difference between. So I want to start there. I want to talk about the difference between culture, co-culture, dominant culture, and cultural identity because it can be really, really confusing. So what is culture? Well, hopefully by now, after having looked at context, you can kind of see that it's the things that we believe in, that we value, that we assume. And a lot of times the way that we define culture is this is what most people see as, quote, normal. And, you know, it's normal to do certain behaviors because it's part of our culture. If you remember in Paula and Mike in the case study, and I'm going to move my camera over here so that you can see this little graph. If you remember in Paula and Mike case study, a lot of people didn't think about why do they even have to eat dinner together, or why don't they just eat separately on their way home? Because sharing a meal, specifically dinner, is part of our culture. And when we start to look at what we mean by culture, we're looking at two really different things. The first was what we call surface culture. That's the stuff that's super easy to see. Language, food, dance. And this is the stuff that you would see maybe if you go to a festival or if you do field book, the field book where you're a visitor. That is surface culture for the most part. Language, dance, dress, all that stuff is on the surface. And by and large, we're actually pretty cool with surface culture when it comes to interacting with different groups. We don't really care that somebody else speaks a different language or dresses differently largely. The things that start to get a little bit dicey and where a lot of intercultural communication breaks down is in what we call deep culture. Deep culture is the stuff that are our values, our beliefs, our priorities. The fact that when two people in the United States get married, generally they move out. They go elsewhere. The fact that we are an individualistic culture, that we value individual achievement over sometimes group achievement. That's deep culture. And that's the stuff where we see it as so normal, it's so ingrained, it's so part of everything we do that it can sometimes get a little bit hard to discern. And that's where we can start going into cultural conflict. Okay, so that's culture. Now, existing within culture, we have two terms. We have dominant culture and we have co-culture. Dominant culture is the culture of the group that has the most power, the most influence, and the most say over what goes. And largely, the dominant culture also defines and puts labels on co-culture. And the way I usually tell students, if they want to see a picture of the dominant culture, I'm using air quotes a lot tonight, a picture of the dominant culture, open a magazine and look at the ads. Because often, that's dominant culture. It's the set of things that that you see as valuable and is put forward as normal and valuable. Okay. Now, in addition, we have co-cultures. Co-cultures are groups of people within the dominant culture that have their own experience, of the world, and that might have a different point of view or value or assumption. So, for example, if you are from a specific ethnic group, that might be a co-culture. If you're from if you're way out rural, if you grew up on a farm, that's a co-culture that is somewhat different than, say, maybe if you lived in a city. So co-culture is all about the smaller groups within a culture that have different expectations. Now, last but not least, we have cultural identity. That's the last one of these words I'm going to put air quotes around, I promise. Cultural identity is what is within every single individual and how they mediate the world. So if you are, someone who lives lives in Potosi, Missouri, and you're an evangelical Christian, and you are part of, like, maybe you are a registered Republican, that is your cultural identity. And I talk to students and talk about this way. You may have two people who are both, Christian, or who are both Jewish, or who are both whatever religion. One person goes to church twice a week and is super involved in youth group, and so for them, their Christianity is an integral part of their identity. For the other person, they go on Christmas and Easter, it's not a very big deal, and so it's not as big of a part of their cultural identity. So we all have our own. And our cultural identity creates, they call it a frame of reference. And a frame of reference is kind of all of these things, their self-concept, our cultural identity, that we kind of walk around and filter the universe through. And it lets us perceive events in a specific way. So that's those three terms. And there's a lot of those kind of terms in this particular chapter that I want you to be cool with. A few other notes really quick. You can see a lot of these things. All these assumptions here, these are Barna's 6 barriers. And so you'll see that popping up from time to time, so just be aware. And there they are again, excuse me. And I want to look at a few things. Here we go. These are the ones that I think sometimes people get a little bit confused. So I want to make sure I cover them because they are on the test. I'm going to move me again. Individualism versus collectivism. Most people are okay with this difference. Individualistic cultures tend to be very much highly valuing individual achievement, whereas collectivistic groups, they're really more in favor of the group being successful. There was a missionary who traveled to Africa in the 50s, and he said, that the African children completely lack moral character. And, if you read the journal, it was actually kind of cool. I got to read the typed journals. They were like, what was happening was that the kids in these schoolhouses were cheating on tests because they felt that if anybody failed, then that was shameful for the whole group, and that their job was to make sure everybody was successful. And so that's an example of individualistic versus collectivistic. The next one down is probably the hardest one to remember, and that's high context versus low context. You can remember this in terms of bluntness. Low context people are very blunt. High context people are not. And I always get people saying, well, does this differ with gender and other things? It can, but there are also high and low context cultures. So, for example, I have a dear friend who was from Iran, very low context culture, and she would look in your face and she would go, "You're gaining weight. Why are you gaining weight? You're pretty. You shouldn't gain weight." Well, that's a low context thing to say, very blunt. Whereas a lot of Americans, they probably wouldn't even mention that. Okay, so we're not super high context. We're probably somewhere in the middle, but she was very low context. High context people will be like hinting at things. They won't say things directly. Monochronic versus polychronic. Monochronic, Americans are monochronic in general. Germans are very monochronic. Basically, it's things happen when they are scheduled to happen, and that is when they happen. If the meeting is at 8, people are there at 8. Polychronic is more time is less important than the individual or the relationship. I had a teacher from New Zealand, and he was very polychronic because he had no concept of the fact that class started at noon and ended at 1:45. He would get there 15, 20 minutes late and be really, really shocked if he'd be really, really shocked if that we were getting up to leave before he was done. So yeah, that's monochronic versus polychronic. Now, please don't immediately jump to the assumption that in a polychronic culture, like the trains don't run on time. It's more about when somebody is late. And we're not entirely monochronic. If you think about when a party starts, if a party starts at 6, you don't show up at 6. You show up a little bit later than that. So we're not necessarily hard and fast on these rules. High uncertainty versus low uncertainty. We are actually a high uncertainty culture, which basically means that we're okay with uncertainty. For example, you can walk into a building, hand somebody many thousands of dollars and walk out with a car, and you don't have to have a relationship with that person. When you think about it, that's kind of strange. You just handed somebody thousands of dollars and all your bank account information, and you're okay with that. A low uncertainty culture, they would want to make sure they had a relationship with you. They would want to get to know you before you did that. Okay. High and low power distance, really quick. High power distance is very concerned with rank and hierarchy. Low power distance is more flat and shared power. In a lot of cases, if I would have to use your last name, that's more high power distance. One thing I thought was really interesting, a friend of mine from India, she wondered why everybody always said please and thank you every time that we interacted. She said in her culture that was very formal, and so you wouldn't say please and thank you to your peers, and so she had a lower power distance culture. Make sure you know that masculine and feminine does not necessarily mean how people dress. It's more about how power is shared, so it doesn't have anything to do with gender. And then those are the big ones that I think people struggle with. All right, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to keep these to 15 minutes. Let me see if there's anything else here. I think that we're probably pretty good if you've got those terms. Look at this last slide. It's really helpful as far as learning how to communicate with people across cultures. And also realize that within every culture, there are norms and rules surrounding all of those characteristics in the very beginning of the chapter. So, for example, Americans express femininity in a very specific way that is different than maybe South America or another culture. So keep those things in mind, and I hope that helps you kind of decode chapter 3. As always, if you need anything, please give me an email, and I'll see you online. Have a great week.